Hello, I'm the mischievous Mark Ginocchio, and I own every issue of Amazing Spider-Man, Amazing Fantasy 15, and all of the annuals, which I still don't think count.
And I'm Dapper Dan Gavosden, and I own every issue of Amazing Spider-Man, including the annuals, which I say definitely count. But for me, Mark, Amazing Fantasy 15 remains a fantasy. Welcome to the Amazing Spider Talk, a show where two fans and collectors uncover the strange, fun, and fascinating history of the Spider-Man comic universe. Thanks for joining us for this review episode of the Amazing Spider Talk.
If you want to swing along with us on our journey through Spidey's past, present, and future, subscribe to Amazing Spider Talk on your favorite podcast app, and of course, leave us a review to help spread the word about our show.
This podcast exists because of the support of our Patreon members. If you want to receive early episodes, exclusive artwork, and help to keep this podcast going 400 episodes strong, go to AmazingSpiderTalk.com and consider joining our Patreon. But today on the show, Mark and I are going to be discussing Amazing Spider-Man Volume 6, number 33. 33rd issues are a special thing, Mark, and I think this proves maybe the case. This issue is written by Zeb Wells. The cover artwork is by John Romita Jr., Scott Hanna, and Marcio Menyz. And the interior artwork is by Patrick Gleason, with colors again by Marcio Menyz, and of course, letters by VC's Joe Caramanga. This issue was first released on September 6th, 2023. All right, Mark, this issue was heavy on vibes, but maybe a little bit light on plot. Why don't you get through the recap here of Amazing Spider-Man Volume 6, number 33?
Yeah, Dan, if I didn't want to annoy our listeners, I would do this all in a Vincent Price voice, a la Thriller or something, we open on, but alas, I know, similar to me singing the songs of Foreigner and stuff, it would get old fast. So instead, we open on Dark Peter, looking quite dark and stoic. He's sitting, contemplating how he no longer has to pretend to ignore what's deep inside him. Kraven has done something to him. He's always doing something to him. And now he's ready to exact punishment since he is no longer the friendly neighborhood Spider-Man. We get a crack of lightning for added effect, and then Peter starts to think about the time Kraven buried him alive and about what he'd like to do to him if he wasn't so friendly. That brings us to Norman Osborn, who is frantically climbing the stairs looking for Peter. Norman sees that Peter is gone, presumably out fighting crime, but then he notices the discarded red and blues and is suddenly in a panic about what Peter is up to. Kraven, meanwhile, he's going through it, thinking about how he was faced down by Spider-Man and ran from him. He affirms to himself that he is Kraven the Hunter, while the voice inside keeps telling him how he ran. He's contemplating how to go up against the Spider-Man and is conflicted by weapons and approach, and that's when he realizes he is no longer the hunter, but the prey. I mean, my goodness, this was really begging for Vincent Price. Well, I'm not going to do it, Dan. I'm not. Finally, Kraven is raring to go, shotgun in hand, but the black-suited Spider-Man crawls up from behind him and stabs him in the neck with a syringe. Kraven is immediately disoriented but starts running from the spider. He is Kraven the Hunted, overwhelmed by the fear of every animal he's previously hunted. He thinks he can get the jump on Spider-Man, but is quickly overtaken. Spider-Man pins him down and tells him he can't believe he was ever scared of Kraven and that he allowed him to bury him alive. Kraven is like, that wasn't me, that was my father. But Spider-Man is all of us talking about the status quo and says, close enough. But then Spidey lets Kraven go, toying with him, and Kraven runs some more before falling into a sewer. Kraven wades through the sewer when a voice tells him to stop so the serum can do its work. And that's when a swarm of vermin appear, smelling something tasty. Apparently Kraven's pheromones. I mean, I guess I'd rather be talking Kraven's pheromones than Silk's. Maybe? I don't know, Dan. We love our pheromones in Amazing Spider-Man. The vermin quickly overtake Kraven, but just as they are ready to administer the kill shot, Spider-Man steps in and starts to throw them overboard. But he's not there to save Kraven, oh no, but instead to throw him into a grave. Spider-Man tosses the shotgun into the grave behind Kraven just in case he wants to skip to the end. And then, of course, we end with Spider-Man tossing dirt onto Craven, and once again, lightning striking. Ooh, what a moody issue, Dan.
Well, Mark, you might not be Vincent Price, but I thought that was a great recap. Although you missed like plenty of opportunities for Gen X references. I mean, no Benji the Hunted reference here. I mean, come on, Mark.
I'm sorry.
I thought better of you. I thought better
All
of
right.
you. Well,
Well,
anyway, an issue like this, I'll just come out of the gate and say I thought this was an incredible issue of Amazing Spider-Man, and it made me really rethink about my feelings about, Craven's Last Hunt retreads, which is kind of a like thing we've gotten a lot of, especially over the past few years between like Hunted and Lost Hunt. And Dark Peter stories, which I think not only have we recorded that Grim Dark Hot Takes episode that we did for season 6, where we're kind of like, Dark Spider-Man stuff isn't really our jam. And it's also kind of been a theme that we've returned to without really any real consistency. I mean, I'm thinking about like Amazing Spider-Man Volume 6, number 27, where in the aftermath of the death of frequent cast member Kamala Khan, Spider-Man went dark for an issue.
right.
Not really. We've been pretty disappointed in some of the kind of returns on both of these ideas. And yet, I thought that this issue was the best of both of those things. Like, I don't know that there's a Craven's Last Hunt or Dark Peter story I like as much as I like this issue. And I'm trying to pick apart why. What do you think, Mark?
Well, I don't want to jump around too much. I'm revealing sausage making here, Dan, but I gotta say, like, everything about this issue, in my opinion, revolves around the talent that is Patrick Gleason. And we could talk very specifically, but from a broad stroke standpoint, not that Zeb Wells didn't contribute a worthwhile script here, but like this comic is all about mood. It's all about vibes, as you said in the intro. And I think to pull off this story, especially in light of all of the kind of disappointing ones, for lack of a better word, that have preceded it in this vein, you really just had to kind of like set a real visual tone and tempo and cadence to it, and Gleason just does it. Like this book to me is all about him, and like I said, we'll still talk more about that later in this episode. But like this is the Dark Peter issue that works, but frankly, it's also like Patrick Gleason's coming out party. I mean, he's already done some great work, but like to me, this is what is going to ascend Gleason into the upper echelon of not just Spider-Man artists, but comic book artists. I'm with you. I felt like that this was just a remarkable improvement on this theme that it just seems like the Spider Office just can't resist. It's like it's always there. But this nails it. I mean, and we still have multiple chapters to go, so we'll see how it ultimately sticks the landing. I mean, we've been here before where we've really liked the initial setup to something and then been let down. But I kind of feel like this is a little different in large part because of the Gleason of it all. What about where do you want to go from that commentary?
Yeah, well, I mean, one of the things that I think is interesting about Craven's Last Hunt, all the way back when it first came out, is how much of deviance in tone and writing style that book is. And I would say the same is true here. Like, if you told me that, like, JMD came back and wrote this, completely in a vacuum from what Zeb Wells was doing, other than the fact that it continues that story, it is an entirely different writing style. And that can be really, like, abrupt and out of nowhere, as I think it kind of is in Craven's Last Hunt, which is why I think I like that story more as a graphic novel thing that exists on its own than any kind of, like, part of Spider-Man's ongoing canon, which it is. And it's a valuable, addition to that. But it just feels so different in its intention and tone and style than like most big two comics. And this is somewhere in between, definitely. Like, but it does feel as abrupt, and yet, what I think makes it work too is that this we spent so long building to get here. This Norman story and the idea of these sins has been percolating for what, like, since the Nick Spencer run, and this is the big payoff to it. Apparently, I mean, it may not be. Ultimately, you're right. We have seen these things just kick the football down the field and give us a disappointing ending, but this really does feel like we've arrived at the fireworks factory, as Alan likes to put it when he comes on the show. And so therefore, like, the Dark Peter also doesn't feel like it's out of nowhere, or that much of a deviation, because, well, it's not even Peter, really. It's like an alternate character that is, sharing Peter's body in some way, or is his darkest secrets revealed. It's not him in his right mind going dark. And so, like, a lot of this stuff just lands without really holding on to all of the stuff that typically detracts from these kind of stories. I mean, even the Kraven Last Hunt of it all, like, most of the repeats of that, or the, like, spiritual successors to that, just dig deeper into the Kravinoff family and that story, or seek to undo it, or soften the blow a little bit. Even, like, Soul of the Hunter is like JMD's apologies for the suicide element in Kraven's Last Hunt, and Grim Hunt is there specifically to undo it. And Lost Hunt, which we got last year, it's JMD, but it's like him mining a minor wrinkle in the minutia of the Kravinoff family. And this just doesn't bother with any of that. It's like, nope, we're doing our own thing. Like, it's going to be an inversion on Kraven's Last Hunt, but it's telling its own, what seems to be, original story and moving it forward, and not, I mean, yes, it is focused on repeating past glories, but it doesn't feel reductive to that original story in any way.
I feel, we're talking about a dark story, so I'll use a crass descriptor here. I think this kind of like steps on the neck of the other, like, kind of Kraven ruminations that we've gotten over the years. It's just like no, we're gonna go all. I think it goes all in on what it needs to go all in on, and then also the things that it does pay homage to. I mean, yes, there are the highlights, if you will. Like, jumping in again to the end a little bit, I thought him tossing the shotgun into the casket was just brilliant, because it was, like, to your point that you were making before, like, the Kraven suicide has always been kind of like this third rail, if you will, even, as celebrated as the story is. I mean, so much so that, JMD himself kind of has retconned aspects of it, or kind of apologized for it. And, this is just like, no, screw that, like, you're gonna want this. Boom. And it was just like, it was a very kind of like stirring moment for me, reading this, being like, oh wow, like, and I also want to talk a little bit about, like, the dark Spider-Man element of it, because, like you said, it's not just like, oh, Spidey's in a mood or something like that. I mean, it seems to be something a little more subverted than that, and I think putting it as an alternative Peter is a good way of putting it, but, like, I also, I came away with the impression, and if this is an odd read on my part, I apologize, but, like, I did feel that these feelings were true to Peter. It was just,
Yes.
Peter of sound mind, without the sins of Norman Osborn coursing through him, would never act on this. And, like, that's going to launch to, if it, as I'm sure it already has in certain circles, a full range of debates about, like, oh, this is, it's out of character. But, like, that's the thing. Like, there was nothing about his thought process and like the inner monologuing that we got that made me feel like that this wasn't true to something that was deep within Peter. I think like I think it's unrealistic and naive to think that people don't have a dark side, but like yes, the more virtuistic, heroic people can suppress it, but like he obviously can't in this scenario because of the MacGuffin of sins. I mean, you could say, oh well, it's sins. What does that mean? But like, I don't know. Like, I think as a premise, it works. And like, again, like in terms of how he acted and what he was thinking, there was nothing in there where I was like, oh, like, why is he going there? Like, like, yeah, this dude buried him alive, and then it was like, well, it wasn't really me. Well, like I made the joke in the recap, but it's like we are on the understanding that this is all Craven now, whether it's the son, the father, the clone, the whatever, it's Craven, and like
Yeah.
this is all the same lineage at this point. So let's just be transparent about it and be like, no, like this guy, Spider-Man is going to go hard after this guy because he did one of the ultimate what's the word I'm looking for? Like defeats a Spider-Man in the history of this character.
Yeah.
So anyway.
Well, I think that's an interesting perspective to take as a pathway to talking about how this book is really an inversion of Craven's Last Hunt, and that's
Right.
really what I like about it. I feel like so many of the other iterations of this, and even down to Hunted, which like I think was trying to get at a really interesting theme about like, what does Peter do basically when he's holding the shotgun? Does he kill Craven? And allow this to happen? And here we're seeing that facilitated by, magic or whatever. But I think what's great about this is it doesn't really try to repeat the themes of the original or explore themes that have been otherwise previously explored, like the kill code, which has been explored to death. Here it looks like I don't know that I've read a Spider-Man story like this before.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah.
like I don't know where this is going to go. Like sincerely have no idea where this story is headed and what it wants to say about these characters. But as to the whole like Cray Jew versus Craven Senior of it all, one of the things that I thought was really neat about this is like it does feel out of nowhere to have the Craven stuff take over this story in the final chapters between Peter and Norman. Like it's Peter and Norman's story. Why are we deviating to Craven? But Wells does a really interesting thing here where he casts Crayju as someone who sees his own father's madness represented in the sins of Norman and not occupied in Peter. And this book really leans into it. And that the idea is like if he can eradicate that, maybe he can eradicate the madness that ultimately drove his father to suicide and ultimately maybe save himself. And I thought that was a really clever way to make this like interjection of Craven into what should be a Peter Norman story make more sense, even if it still feels like a left turn into, monologuing with your fear and all that stuff. That was enough to convince me. I see this kind of like triangle that they're establishing here between these characters and how they all relate with each other, which I think is very true to even Craven's Last Hunt, where it's like half of that book isn't about Spider-Man. It's about Craven and Vermin fighting each other, So like in that regard, I think this one works in a similar way and is similarly successful as a continuation of the ongoing narrative that we've been getting thus far.
Well, it's funny you said that. You said what you said, Dan, because like you got me thinking about something that honestly I had not thought about in the aftermath of reading this comic, which is, when you start talking about like kind of the cyclical nature of father and sons and the sins of the father and how they impact the son, my mind immediately starts to go to the other very famous J.M. DeMatteis story from Spider-Man Past, which was The Child Within, which is about Peter and Harry and Vermin and Ashley Kafka and all of these other characters, and I'm starting to get a lot of like parallels to that story here in terms of, especially coming on the light of Norman more or less professing to Peter, or excuse me, Peter professing to Norman in the last issue that, I'm finally starting to see the father figure in you that you've always kind of talked about. And it was for the longest time an abusive relationship. And it's the irony of like, as this relationship is finally starting to become a healthy relationship, that because of the sins of Norman, Peter has gone down this path. It's setting up some very interesting parallels to the struggle that Harry went through that ultimately led to his demise, which was retconned and retconned and retconned again, or whatever, wherever we ended up on that. But
and yet to be retconned further, I'm sure. But
yeah, and look, I mean, I'm not. Maybe that's an overread on my part, or maybe that's where Zeb Wells is going with all this. But like, I definitely think that like, it is kind of funny because I feel like of all the Spider-Man writers we've had in recent years, the one that was, I feel, most heavily influenced by Jan DeMatteis was Nick Spencer, and yet I feel like, I'm not trying to compare and contrast here, but like I feel like Zeb is hitting on some of the themes a little more acutely than Nick. Maybe it just didn't execute, I feel, as well from Nick's end, whereas I think Zeb is kind of hitting on those emotional notes with a little more clarity. And like I said, even pulling in from other,
it is interesting just to see like the kids who grew up reading those comics when they came out are now in charge of these books, and
right.
That's a cyclical process. I don't think Dan Slott was quite as locked into one era or another in where he pulled from, but it seems to me very clear like Zeb Wells and Nick Spencer are readers of a certain era, and that is what their books are really focusing on. And that actually like leads to an interesting point here. I want to talk about how this book is an inversion of Kraven's Last Hunt, but even the role of Norman is very interesting in this book because in my idea, Norman is kind of taking the place of Mary Jane in this story. Now I know we've got Mary Jane on a variant cover coming up for this book where, she's like being held by Black Suit Spider-Man. So maybe she has a part yet to play in this. But the idea of like Norman running up to the window and seeing Spider-Man gone and worrying about the state of him, like clearly puts him in the place of Mary Jane, whether he's like Peter's new wife or whatever, like he's a member of Peter's family that's worrying about him.
Right.
And, I'm curious to see, where that goes. Like Mary Jane's window as a portal out into this dangerous world that Peter was lost in, and her kind of search for him led her into trouble with Vermin and, a bunch of like male figures on the street that eventually had her collide with Kraven dressed up as Spider-Man. There's many places that could go, and I could see Norman fulfilling that role. He looks out the window, but to him it's a mirror, and I thought that was a really interesting piece of writing from Wells. And I'm excited to see like where this takes Norman on this journey, because I think obviously this is a big culminating chapter, and putting him in the Mary Jane role I think is actually really fascinating for this comic.
Yeah, absolutely.
Were there any other inversions of the script here that you were particularly fond of? I know you mentioned the like tossing the rifle down into the grave.
Yeah. I mean, just like Cravens and Crayju, however. I still have a hard time calling them Crayju. I'm not gonna lie. Clone Craven. I found his entire inner monologue to be so fascinating in terms of inversions here because it's obviously in Craven's Last Hunt, Craven's monologue is very focused on like, being the hunter, and like this is, Crayju's is so much about being the hunted, and like he's trying to fight it, and kind of again going back to the father son of it all, like trying, he's basically having an argument with himself or his father in his head, or however you want to put it, about what he should be doing here, and like disgracing the family, but like at the same time, like he just having him be the prey, which the solicits kind of gave that away, but like it still was, I felt, written very thoughtfully, and obviously the Gleason's art supported it wonderfully. It's like I got real fear and apprehension. I mean, I made the joke about the pheromones in the recap, but the fact of the matter is like the way the words were kind of lifting off the page from Craven's inner monologue, like it kind of felt like pheromones kind of coming off the page, like it was just pure fear.
Yeah.
It was just pure fear, pure fear and anxiety, and cortisol and all those other chemicals that are you are not good if you're giving off too many of them. So anyway, that's just my other big takeaway in terms of the inversion of it all.
I mean, yeah, there's that one image of him like running and reflecting that he's the prey, of that like vertical close up of his face, of his eyes bulging. Like I've never seen Craven presented that way, and that's to say, I also thought that the writing from Wells of like everyone, responding to their unconscious fear-based thoughts was handled much better in this issue than it was the previous issue. Mainly because it was consistent in this issue. Everybody was engaging in this way with their fears and how they countered their active mind. And I just love that. The bit with Craven, where he sees himself as a variety of animals in fleeing, because we've always seen him like reflect on like, I am the tiger, I am the whatever, and I am the hunter. But seeing it the other way around, where he's like, I'm sympathizing with my prey for once, was an interesting inversion on all of that. And then another one I wanted to point out, I think when you think back on Craven's Last Hunt in terms of spider imagery, I think a lot of people remember like the rat and the spiders fighting on top of the grave, and Peter following the spider to the light to escape his tomb and crawling his way out. But the book opened weirdly with like Peter in a kind of like humorous scene, and at least in the way it's drawn, it's like a lighter version of Mike Zeck's interpretation of Peter, and really like one of the few times we see Peter's face in Craven's Last Hunt. Where it almost looks like a John Romita Jr. face. And he sees a spider on the wall, and he squishes the spider out of fear, like something is coming in the night. And he even crushes like his own animalistic totem on the wall. But here the inversion is that he's not going to be afraid, and he aggressively squishes the spider in the beginning in this like gross, like super hyper aggressive fashion. And I was like, okay, we're not getting the same story here. And I thought that was really a clever way of telling us like we're not in the same type of Craven story this time around. Mark, what did you think about the inclusion of Vermin in this story? Because like, Vermin always seems to come back for these Craven stories, even though he's not really an integral member of Spider-Man's cast. Not in the way Kamala Khan is, but
right.
Of course, no one would doubt that.
Well,
is it attached with a rivet gun? Because like sometimes you can just feel like it's like playing with fearful symmetry, if you will, just to include Vermin, and it doesn't fit. Did it fit for you here?
Yes and no. I mean, just to your previous point, I did want to joke at some point that Vermin technically wouldn't have been allowed in our game with Tristan for our 400th episode because I think he was created in a Captain America comic by J.M. DeMatteis. So just putting that out there
right.
in terms of his integralness to Spider-Man continuity. I mean, like this Vermin's inclusion here definitely felt like a touch of fan service, but I also felt it was effective in the moment. I don't necessarily feel it was rivet gun territory, but like, there was definitely a moment of like, oh, of course, here we go. I mean, like once he was in the sewer, it's like, okay, bring on the vermin, and of course it was like, and it was still different, like because it was the multiple vermin. I kind of just liked how. Again, it's Spider-Man kind of playing out Kraven's Last Hunt in a way that's both fan servicey, but also kind of trying to prove a larger point here of kind of pushing Kraven through what he felt he was pushed through, alternatively back in the day. So, it worked. I don't think I would have been disappointed if he didn't show up, if that makes sense. But like, I wasn't like, oh, come on, like it was just like, okay, here we go. Yeah. bring him on.
I think it works explicitly because of the stated goal from Spider-Man to put Kraven through what he was put through. And so therefore it works for me. And I will say, like, that's one of the things from Nick Spencer's run that I liked as an update to characters. I think the multiple vermin thing is cool, if only because in the name it could be singular or plural.
Right.
And like, say what you will about like people say, oh, Wells #1 is such a departure from the setup that he was given, with the end of the Nick Spencer run. But I think some things like this shows that Wells is really like a good yes and player. Like he's taken a lot from the Nick Spencer run and continued to develop it. Not to mention the Norman Osborn sins of it all is a Nick Spencer creation, and that he's just taking it to another conclusion. And so I think Wells has proven himself like a good player with the character and willing to have fun with what people did before. And I appreciate that. Anytime people can make every story feel worthwhile in some way.
Oh yeah, I feel like this run has utilized far more of the Nick Spencer run than I think it had any right to, and that's not a slag at the Nick Spencer run, but it was just like, oh, okay, like I mean, obviously the big elephant in the room is the Mary Jane relationship, but like again, like I feel like we're getting an exploration of other relationships and other little nuances that were set up that we wouldn't have maybe not have got. I don't even know if Nick Spencer was going to see it through. I mean, maybe he was. I mean, we have reasons to believe he might have in some cases. Anywho, do you want to talk a little bit about the Slack before we get onto some other awesome parts of the story?
Yeah, absolutely. Mark, tell us about the Slack.
Well, of course, hundreds of listeners like you hang out in our community of Spider-Man fans on Slack. The amazing Spider Slack community is absolutely free to join, and you can jump into active conversations with awesome people about collecting, conventions, movies, new comics, old comics, and much, much more. Dan, what's been going on in the Slack this week besides everyone just going, oh my God, Mark's got Amazing Fantasy 15?
Yeah, that was big news in the Slack, and it was cool you revealed it there first in the Slack before we even recorded episode 400. So that community got a little bit of a tease there. Mark showing up once in a blue moon just to tell us like little tidbits like, I got Amazing Fantasy 15. Mark knows when to show up and drop a bomb.
I know my audience. I know how to play them along, right?
Absolutely. This is going to be a weird update, but it is something I'm proud of. Is that this week in the Slack, we really came together as a community to talk about the rules of the Slack, because I really wanted to make it an even safer and more enjoyable place to be, focused entirely on a shared space for those of us who love Spider-Man. And with like all the social media platforms melting down, I know myself personally, without getting too much into the details, feel fairly unsafe on some of them in terms of just like expressing my joy for a comic like, say, the one we're reviewing today, without getting like a whole community of people slagging on me. And I felt like changes were needed in the Slack to make it even more safe and fun for people to come in and truly know that they're not going to have to deal with that stuff. So we came together as a community and set up like a series of 5 rules about engagement in the Slack that were very clear not to, become a sort of censorship, but really just to like do what our show has been doing for such a long time, which is to create a space of like mutual respect and adoration for the characters. Like it, don't like it. Everybody's opinions are valid, but we always make sure we treat each other with respect. And having those kind of bylaws out there, I don't know why I waited so long, mostly because the community has always been so nice. I didn't feel like I needed to, but it does feel good to like have a place where everybody agrees on like a core tenet. And it makes me even more proud of the Slack and the people that are in it. And I'll say, if you've ever left the Slack because you felt otherwise, or you want to check it out because that sounds appealing right now in 2023 with the X's of the world and this confused space where you find your Spider-Man people, the Slack is it. I really remain so proud of it, and I hope everybody comes and checks it out. There's a link in the description of this episode that'll let you sign up in less than a minute. Like Mark said, it's always free. Come on in. We crossed well over 500 people in there now, and it's always looking for 1 or 2 more.
Awesome, Dan. All right. Well, why don't we get back into this issue here? Why don't we talk a little bit more about the use of the black costume here? How obviously, anytime the black costume comes into play, there's always some, I don't want to say controversy, but it kind of feels like an event. How did this all go for you in terms of the setup with Spider-Man and his threads here?
Well, I mean, I think it's completely justified, and I'm calling this new character Sinister Spider-Man. I know there was a book called that where Venom was Spider-Man during the Dark Reign era of comics, but this to me, I mean, I guess maybe he's Sinner Spider-Man. I don't know. Sinister Spider-Man to me, that's who this is. I'm sure there will be an official name at some point. But I thought the setup to the use of the black costume was cool. Like it kind of defines the character in a nutshell. It's like he's had this thing in his closet. He doesn't want to admit that it's there, and his better instincts have kept him from ever taking it out. But the better instincts aren't around anymore, and he's not going to be friendly, and he's putting on the black suit. And I felt like if that is your guiding principle for how to write this character, like it says it all right there in that opening part of the book. This is who this is. He's the kind of Peter that would wear the black suit again. And I love the justification even further, just like, mechanically, is that the Osborn suit like actually was overloading in that issue we saw at the end of the previous, or the page we saw at the end of the previous issue. So it's all blown out, and all the lights are destroyed, and maybe that's a metaphor too. The lights have gone out, and welcome in the black.
We're back in black, baby.
So, Mark, what did you think about this characterization of Peter? We've talked a little bit about it, but like this is truly a new way of writing this character. And last episode, I said something along the lines of like, I'm really curious how Peter is going to be written as a character. Like, and you've said a little bit on this already, but like, were there highlights? Is there things here that make you more curious about this Peter? Are there things you think we can learn about Peter through this process?
What are we gonna learn? That I don't know. I as I alluded to in earlier in the episode, I I was along for the ride here and into this characterization because I felt like at its core this was true to the character. You know, like I feel like we always need to remember when we get a story like this that, you know, going all the way back to Amazing Fantasy 15, it's, you know, Peter Parker is a character who, you know, is initially guided by a desire to kind of, you know, prove the haters wrong, if you will, and and shut down the naysayers. And you know, it's of course the mistake of Uncle Ben that drives him into this, you know, this course of heroism. But like, I don't feel like that those other characteristics have necessarily completely gone away. You know, he just can suppress them to do the responsible thing, and obviously he is in a scenario where he can't now. You know, like due to, you know, whatever means you want to consider getting injected with a spear of sins can be. You know,
that old chestnut, yeah,
that old chestnut. But like, so I as a result, I'm looking at this through the lens of like, okay, you know, is this consistent with the person who on the cover of Amazing Fantasy 15 goes, I'm gonna show them, and you know, who you know, wants to at multiple points during the Lee Ditko run, you know, punch out Flash Thompson, and you know, if only I could, you know, but I can't because I'm responsible, because I'm doing the right thing. You know, it's not so much that I feel that this sinister Spider-Man is being guided by revenge and exacting punishment, as much as I feel like this is someone who is not letting the responsibility take over. And I mean, that was my takeaway, and that's why it works for me, because I feel like yes, he's being the aggressor here, so you know, there's obviously some retribution attached to that, but like I also feel like a lot of this is just him kind of being like, you're just getting what you deserve finally, you know what I mean? Like, I don't know, like am I making sense, or am I kind of talking in circles here?
No, I think you're right. I mean, I think it's the Peter that has the voice of Uncle Ben quieted. You know, like it is nothing is there to correct his latent desires, which, you know, are often selfish. Like you said, punch back behavior, prove the haters wrong. You know, this is a character that still acknowledges his past and is aware of his transformation. You know, he's just a new man now. And the thing that I really appreciate about it is that it wasn't just a retread of Superior. Like, this is very different than Superior.
Yes.
This is not a guy who's interested in heroics. He's out for himself. Revenge, retribution, you know, listening to his inner demon, so to speak. So perhaps this is the first time with, like, Peter's mask fully pulled back. You know, like what is that? You know, what is going on inside there, and what if he's listening purely to fear? You know, we have this dialogue going on where all these characters have these dualities inside them of Kraven, who is trying to stand up and noble and be proud, the hunter, but really he eventually admits, no, I'm the prey. This is a Spider-Man that's not having that dialogue. He is just that base level instinct, and I found that deeply interesting. And there are still elements that I recognize there, like even him throwing that rifle down to Kraven, as much of a cruel joke as it is. There is a weird, twisted sense of mercy there. Like, I'm giving you an out. Like, so I don't know. Do you think? This is a question that maybe will be answered, and I hope this whole story isn't built around asking this question, because I think it's interested in something bigger than the kill code, which I think is like a tired trope at this point. But do you think this Peter is capable of murder? Because to me, he's still, even when he buries Craven, he's just toying with him.
Yeah, that's the thing. I don't see that yet. In terms of what they set up, like, because there are multiple parts of this story where Peter could have killed Craven, and he intentionally doesn't.
Yeah.
Like this is, to me, this is clearly Peter trying to prove a point. And being malicious and malevolent about it, but still proving a point. Like, is the point that, like, the part of the controversy of Craven's Last Hunt is the fact that, like, that suicide was an option. It was like,
Yeah.
it's like Craven taking the coward's way out. Like, he's not facing, like, Spider-Man can't get the win because Craven robs him of that. Like, and I think that's, I think this Peter is cognizant of that. It feels to me like it's more important that Peter gets to show this Craven, like, what he did to him, but, like, what I would have done to you or your father, or however you want to put it, if I could, if you didn't shoot yourself. And, like, I think, like, again, yeah, throwing the gun down the grave was, like, a very much like a, like, if you're going to be a coward like your dad, here you go.
Yeah.
But, anyway, no, I don't think it's going in that direction. And yeah, we'll see. But, like, my takeaway was this is far more emotionally charged than just killing. Like, this is about showing something bigger going on here, and I think humiliating him.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I also wonder if maybe he's even offering him like a tortured path to redemption, right? If he can experience what his father put Peter through, maybe he can come out the other side changed in some way. And you see, like, Craven kind of talking about that, like, if I can just get rid of the madness of my father, maybe I can be my own man, and I wonder if part of this is Peter testing this Craven to see if he can be a bigger man than his father and perhaps change his path. I know right now we're just treating this Peter as evil, but I wonder if there's his own sick and twisted version of heroics going on here that is yet to play out. I honestly don't know. One of the other things I found really interesting about this comic, and even the comic previous, the final page of the previous issue, we see Peter's transformation, but we don't ever see his face. And Norman, throughout this issue, references how terrifying the face was, and Craven too, that he ran from it. And here it's kept intentionally in the dark in the opening pages where we don't see his face. We see a brief, like, glint on his eye. And, like, so it's obviously setting up a very dramatic reveal of what that face looks like. And I wonder if we saw a preview of it in that vision in issue 31, where there was a sort of, like, goblinized Peter underneath the mask in, like, that kind of ayahuasca trip that Craven and Queen Goblin were on. But, that's something I think that we've yet to see, is, like, what does he even look like under this? It seems to be an intentional, like, tease and withholding, and I'm excited for that visual if it is to come, which I suspect it is. We've already talked about both of them, but in terms of writing, I thought this book had some great one-liners. Specifically, I'm not my father, and Peter saying, close enough. And of course, here's this, in case you want to skip to the end. I mean, they're kind of darkly funny, and there was definitely some, like, dark comedy in this. Even, like, Vermin getting his teeth punched out made me laugh. And I think Wells, when his comedy is directed in the right way, it really lands. And it reminds me of Nick Spencer. Like, not all of his jokes I thought were timed appropriately or landed, but when they did, they really worked. And, this is kind of like the second comedy writer we've had on the book. Anyway, I wanted to point those out.
Yeah. Let's talk about Gleason, though. I know I kind of opened the show talking about him, but let's dive in deep here to kind of wrap this review here, because yes, Wells did some great writing here, but this is such a visual book. This issue specifically, and they were trying to pull something off here that, people have attempted in Spider-Man before with mixed results, but did Gleason's art just really capture it? What were your big takeaways with what Gleason did here?
I mean, I think this is his best work on the title yet, and maybe that's because he gets to lean into using his inks in a heavier way, really playing with the darkness of this. I think about there's a lot of iconic images in this. When I think about that image of Spider-Man dragging Kraven at the end into a pure negative field of black, that to me is really exemplary, or an example of what was great about this comic is the visual pacing of it, using a lot of vertical slices, but finding the exact right image to put in there. Breaking up the panels into trippy, drug, things. And I don't know, to me, this is the first book of his that I was like, man, he absolutely nailed unlike a Dicko issue 33 level visual pacing in a comic. I think this is a masterclass on how to do that. I would put it up there with JR's best stuff. I think it was issue 23 of this arc where Peter returns and ends up fighting Captain America. I thought was another visual stunner. I mean, these guys are operating at the top of the game, and this is, I think, his best stuff yet in that avenue. How about you? Were there any images or sequences that stood out to you in particular?
I mean, many. I mean, just that first visual of Spider-Man in the black mask, and it's and I think it's going to be the lead image of our podcast banner title here for this episode. It's trippy, but it's also monstrous. Just everything with from the cracks of lightning, the burying of Kraven at the end, and it's direct references to Kraven's last hunt. I mean, a lot of references to other famous Spider-Man stories, including even the red and blues in the garbage can, which kind of reminded me of Spider-Man No More. In it. I mean, just a lot of obviously a lot of visual references to past Kraven story, but like I said, it just every panel just set a mood, and like you said, there's not a lot of plot in this book. I mean, even from a recap standpoint, this was probably one of my shorter recaps that I've done. And yet, it just felt so visually rich and so emotionally charged because of those visuals. This really felt like a full story, even if there wasn't a lot that happened. So I mean, this whole issue to me visually is instantly iconic. There's, it's have your pick of visuals,
The comic that this most reminds me of, and maybe this will be reflective in our grading as well of this comic, is Superior Spider-Man #9, which is I think the one and only comic that we gave AA pluses to,
right.
And it's just Spider-Man, fighting for his life or whatever, and it's a really unusual scenario, but it is light on plot, heavy on vibes, and really an artist showcase, which I think Amazing Spider-Man has become over the past decade. It's been a showcase for the best in the industry. You mentioned the visual references. I had a big smile on my face. As much as it's fan service, turning the page and finding Amazing Spider-Man 294's cover as like interior artwork that made sense in the moment, whereas it never did in the original. Like none of the covers for Kraven's Last Hunt really like match up with the interior of the comics, whether their costumes are different or whatever. You know,
well, the Web of 32 does, but other than that,
okay, sure, that's fair. That's fair. You know, or seeing just the identical repetition of the angles of Kraven burying Spider-Man or Spider-Man burying Kraven was really cool. But you're right, like, you know, about it rhythmically too. Like the original Kraven's Last Hunt is punctuated by like these sound effects of, you know, the shovels digging, you know, like the ringing, you know, of various things. It's a like really atmospheric book, and I feel like that rhythm is here too. Shout out to Marcio Menyz, who I think, Mark, is he the best colorist in comics? Because I think he is. Like at the very least, I think he's the best colorist in Spider-Man history. And stop me if I'm going like way at, like, has there been a thing that he's done that is not absolutely drop dead gorgeous?
Well, no, I mean, absolutely. I mean, the only pushback I'll give you is there's still Edgar Delgado out there, but Marcio Menyz is, I think, right on par with what Edgar has done with the book over the years, for sure. So
I would put him above Edgar. No disrespect to Edgar. Like,
oh man,
I think Marcio is on another level. But
interesting.
I don't know. Taste is what taste is.
Okay.
I turned the page and I immediately thought of you, Mark, in the like. I would call it a clear McFarlane reference of Spider-Man, like in his most bendy, like black suit, you know, lightning striking behind him mode. I mean, like nobody bended Spider-Man like McFarlane did, and this, to me, like it's so much that his like blackness of his face is melding into his like groin, I guess, is what I would call it. But like the Joe Caramanga's like laughter, like crisscrossing the page, like what an image. I mean, anyway, we could talk forever about all of the incredible artwork in here, and maybe we still wouldn't do it enough justice. But this is one of those comics I finished and then read twice more immediately. Like, and there's few books I feel like Superior 9 was like that, like Amazing Spider-Man's like 698 to 700 were like that. Like there's few things where I put it down and I'm like, what did I just read? I stood up with my wife sitting next to me and like paced around the room and I was like, what an issue. Like, you know, like it got me that hyped, you know.
Wow.
And you can call me whatever you want to call me, a shill or whatever. Like I enjoyed this comic. And you know, I don't know. I mean, like that, you know, whatever praise that is, I thought it was a great comic book. Do you want to get to grades, or do you want to add any final thoughts?
No, I think we can get to grades. I mean, I will just add, how dare you like things, Dan?
Yeah, I know. Sue me. What are you gonna
do? I'll go first, just in case you want to, like, you know, like go double down and one up me or something. But I'm giving this an A, Dan. Like this is the best issue of Amazing Spider-Man we've gotten in several years, in my opinion. You know, and that includes even some of the last of the Dead Language arc, which I enjoyed issues of, but you know, ultimately felt unfulfilled by. This was just great. I loved it. A.
I still think that issues 4 and 5 like are in tight contention in this run, just because I thought, like, I don't think I've ever had the rug pulled out underneath me like quite like that, and then to respond with such humanity in issue 5 I thought was really beautiful. But I mean, like, this is hemming and hawing. I think this is like as close to a masterstroke comic as you get. The only thing that brings it down for me is that it is so derivative of Kraven's Last Hunt. And again, I think it does good things with that, but it doesn't truly stand out as its own unique interpretation of the character in the way that I felt like issues 4 and 5 did. But this is an A for me. So solid flat A. You know, boy, I can't wait to see where this arc goes, because if it follows on this trajectory, I say this at the start of every arc, you know, and maybe that's what makes World Without Love stand out to me, the issues 1 through 5, because it did end so strong.
Right.
It remains one of the few arcs of Spider-Man that ends better than it starts. So there you go.
There you go.
Two A's. Look at us.
We are all Disco Stew saying if these trends continue. Anyway, there you go.
But the trends are not going to continue tonight because, Mark, we got to end this show.
Yeah, it's that time. Time for all good things to come to an end. So we want to say thank you to you, the listeners and viewers, for tuning in to this episode of The Amazing Spider Talk.
Yeah, this podcast exists because of listener support on Patreon. So for only $3.99 a month, you can help support our show's existence while getting early episodes, including these reviews the same weeks the comics release, exclusive artwork, and a ton of other bonuses. Mark and I are cooking up something really awesome for everybody that probably will be out by the time that you hear this. So check your email if you are a Patreon supporter. But as always, thank you to everyone who already supports us in the work that we do. And a special thanks to our newest contributor, Derek Keogh, and to Thaddeus Smith for upgrading his tier and supporting us even more. Thank you to both of you so much for helping Mark and I do what we do.
Yeah, I would say you're just helping me do it.
Just Mark. He's the one that does all the work.
Exactly. No, thank you both. Of course, to download our earliest episodes, including interviews with legendary creators like Jan DeMatteis, who talks about Kraven's Last Hunt, Tom DeFalco, Ron Friends, Mark Bagley, David Michelini, and many more, subscribe to our Amazing Spider Talk Back Issues podcast on Apple Podcasts.
So, Mark, until we offer an option at the start of our podcast to, quote, skip to the end, end quote, what's our motto?
With great podcasts, there must also come the Amazing Spider Talk.
Don't miss the next installment.
It's just a shotgun barrel that extends out of your phone and puts an end to the whole thing.
Just stop, Dan.
It just spares you the misery of listening to us talk about Spider-Man for an hour.
Oh my. All right.